this video, we're going to look at the key thinkers in socialism. And just a very, very brief recap. 5 key thinkers per ideology. We will look at some other thinkers that need to be mentioned but do not count. And the caps on your 24-mark essay if you don't mention your 2 key thinkers, capped at level 2. And if you don't have a balanced argument, capped at level 2 as well. Again, no requirement to have different key thinkers from different sides of an argument, but your essay will read better if you can draw on different key thinkers to support different arguments. Socialism then, as we saw in the class notes and the other work we've done, the key thinkers are Marx and Engels, Rosa Luxembourg, Webb, Anthony Crosland and Anthony Giddens. And some of the other people we'll mention would be Lenin, Edward Bernstein, and we'll mention Beverages and Keynes. I know they'd probably be horrified to be put into socialist key thinkers, but they do have a role in the development of social democracy. Okay, so on to Marx and Engels, a bit of the Spice Girls there, 2 become 1. Lots of stuff you can find out about Marx. Fascinating character, probably never had a proper job. At best you might describe him as a failed journalist, but he really was a kind of full-time philosopher, which really made him a terrible husband and a terrible provider for his family. And he relied for most of his life on handouts from his colleague and friend Engels. And of course the irony of that is Engels' family was the epitome of the new bourgeoisie. You know, his father owned textile mills in Germany and Manchester, and that money is used to fund probably the greatest attack on capitalism and the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels, and they're put together because lots of the stuff we associate with Marx, I mean, they're really developed by Engels after Marx's death, especially some of the sayings. But in the combined writings of Marx and Engels, you get the locus classicus, the starting point of the core themes and the themes that run throughout socialism. Marx's great unlocking of history, that the key to history was understanding, social classes, the role of revolution and conflict between classes in terms of human nature. Believe that we are naturally fraternal, altruistic, but we've been corrupted by capitalism. The capitalist economy was corrupt and exploitative and unreformable, and capitalism had to be rooted out, root and branch, and replaced by a system of common ownership. Common ownership then would lead to the abolition of private property, equality. It was all about absolute equality, everybody having broadly equal shares. And the state as then constituted was merely what he described as a bourgeois state. It was simply a tool of the bourgeoisie, or a committee for organising the affairs of the bourgeoisie, and it was unreformable. And after the revolution, it would be replaced by a worker state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's actually the stage that Marx calls socialism in historical development, before the state itself would eventually wither away, which is a bit rich coming from a man who criticised the utopian socialists, but the state would eventually wither away. In terms of the means of achieving socialism, well, clearly Marxist-Leninism is revolutionary, and we saw in the class notes how capitalism they believed was unstable and it would lead to a series of successive booms and busts. Didn't say how long it would last, but eventually the proletariat will be subjected to progressive immiseration. The conditions would get worse off until eventually they became so intolerable the working class would spontaneously achieve class consciousness, which would lead to a spontaneous class revolution. He's eminently quotable. I mean, the Communist Manifesto is quite short, it's nice to read, and there's lots of little quotes you can put in to support your argument as well. But essentially you understand these because really the narrative of the rest of the topic is really a retreat from the original principles as propounded by Marx and Engels, and we see that in the class notes. The importance of class, common ownership, the abolition of capitalism, the idea of the bourgeois state, and the search for absolute equality. So it's worth spending a bit of time or rereading the class notes and grasping what those key positions are what you describe as fundamentalist socialism. So that's the first two, Marx and Engels. Okay, if we move on to the next other thinker, Lenin. And Lenin you would mention in links with revolutionary socialism. And Marx's Lenin is a development on, and it's a move away from Marx's concept of a revolution. Because Lenin believed that the proletariat would never spontaneously achieve class consciousness. He saw the workers in St. Petersburg and to a certain extent in Germany, and he thought that they had been bought off by very limited social reforms, and he developed what he called, you can imagine very derogatorily, trade union consciousness, only concerned about terms and conditions and getting what little crumbs they could from capitalism. So therefore, Lenin argued that the revolution could be and should be forced or accelerated. You shouldn't or couldn't wait for this historical determinism of Marx, the succession of booms and busts. He did also argue that it wasn't right that you would wait until the spontaneous class consciousness would be achieved, because then you'd be condemning successive generations of working class to immiseration, and that you could and should force the revolution. In order to do this, you had to set up a group of professional revolutionaries, a small dedicated group, and this group would be a vanguard party who would in effect lead the drive towards revolution, and then the working class would be brought along behind it. And after the revolution, again, you'd have the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there you can see a tension even within revolutionary socialism between Marx's and Engels' vision and in Lenin's view as well. Which then leads us on to the next key thinker, which is Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg was Polish, but then she became a German citizen. Quite an attractive character in many respects. She left the German SDP, which is the Socialist Party, after they supported the war in 1914. She founded the Spartacus League with her colleague Karl Liebknecht, out of which emerged the German Communist Party, and both her and Liebknecht were murdered by the Free Corps in 1919. In many ways, she was quite faithful to Marx's ideas, and she was very empathetic towards the working class. And there is a slight misconception that all socialists must necessarily be very sympathetic and empathetic towards the working class, and that's not necessarily the case, because some hardline ideologues and fundamentalists, for them the working class was simply a social class that had been or had a historical role in overthrowing capitalism in line with Marx's determinism. They were just a group of people who had this role to overthrow capitalism, and often people could be very derogatory about the working class and very frustrated with them. You can imagine Lenin spitting out whatever the Russian for trade union consciousness was. And you can see the kind of the patronising way some other thinkers might address the working class as well. But not Luxemburg. Luxemburg, lived among the working class. She had great faith in working class people, in developing their own institutions, and working people could then manage society after the revolution as well. So in some respects, Luxemburg agreed with Lenin that you couldn't wait for this progressive immiseration, that it simply wasn't fair on generations of workers, and you had to agitate for revolution. But she completely disagreed with Lenin in this need for a vanguard party. She simply said that would lead to an absolute dividing wall between the leaders and the led, and in a way she was quite right in terms of what happened, and that you just replaced one group of leaders with another, and in the words of the Who, meet the old boss same as the new boss. And Luxemburg had faith in workers, and she felt that by organising workers, and especially through industrial action, she could help workers to achieve class consciousness, and then they would have a revolution and overthrow capitalism, and then they would run the state themselves. And she thought workers' engagement in industrial action would help them achieve class consciousness. So again, Luxemburg is a revolutionary socialist, but she disagrees with Marx and disagrees with Lenin, and puts more faith in the working class. So in terms of some of the core themes, you can see she's very big on workers' control, that the post-capitalist economy would have workers' control. Human nature, again, like all socialists, we're naturally cooperative and fraternal, And she believed she could see that in the working class community she worked in. Even under capitalism, she could see the kind of prototype or embryonic type of community you could have when capitalism has gone away. Ends of socialism: common ownership, obviously run by workers, absolute equality, and very similar views on the state. The state was a bourgeois state, and like Marx, you had to get rid of it. Again, the means of achieving socialism: she was revolutionary, spontaneous revolution, but only after the working class. You helped the working class to achieve class consciousness through mass action. So she disagreed with Marx and Engels. So in those kinds of essays about tensions within the means of achieving socialism, even when you're talking about revolutionary socialism, there are tensions within that strand as well. And then you have some of the Luxembourg's quotes down there, which then leads us on to a shift and move away from revolutionary socialism towards evolutionary socialism or gradualism. And key person here was Bernstein. Bernstein was a member of the German SDF. And in his book, Evolutionary Capitalism, Bernstein argued that capitalism was highly adaptable. It wasn't doomed to collapse. And this is a significant move away from the original fundamentalist position. And he was critical of Marx and Engels. He said they kind of fiddled their research, that they said that capitalism was doomed to collapse. It was definitely doomed, where Bernstein said, well, actually, the evidence might show it only had a tendency towards collapsing. There was no necessarily exact reason why it should, that it may or may not, there's different paths it could take, and that it wasn't, a scientific inevitability. And then he moved on, very controversially, to say that capitalism did not have to be exploitative of the working class, that despite the terrible conditions they were under, the underlying graph, if you like, was upwards. Conditions and wages were gradually improving, and they could improve even further, and that you could use capitalism and it could coexist alongside socialism to provide for a better society. So Bernstein's the original revisionist socialist, if you like, and feeds into both evolutionary socialism and later on we'll see social democracy, which takes us on to next key thinker, which is Beatrice Webb. In many ways, Beatrice Webb is typical of many British intellectual socialists. Came from a very middle class family. Her cousin was Charles Booth, the great social reformer. We'd now call him a social scientist. And she helped him when he was preparing his Life and Labour of the People of London. She had a romantic relationship with Joseph Chamberlain, the Liberal politician, and she famously co-authored a minority report on the Poor Law Commission report of 1909, which clearly predated the Beveridge report by 30 years in providing an outline for a welfare state. And of course, one of her researchers at the time was none other than one William Beveridge. Herself and the husband also have found the New Statesman, which some of you might read, kind of left of centre, left-wing magazine. And they also did found the London School of Economics with an inheritance that they got. So Webb builds on Bernstein's, she was a contemporary of Bernstein, idea of a gradual transition to a socialist society. And Webb, herself and her husband, were members of in England, the Fabian Society, one of these small socialist groups within the Labour movement. And Fabian Society is named after a Roman general, Fabius Maximus. And Maximus was appointed general of the Roman armies in the Second Punic War against Hannibal, when Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, invades Italy. And he's a much more superior general, and he defeats the Romans in several battles. And Fabius decides they're not powerful enough to take on Hannibal in a straight battle. So what he does, retreats further down the leg of Italy, and he gets Hannibal to lengthen his supply lines. And then he carries out what we would now call a guerrilla war against Hannibal's armies. In other words, he plays the long game. He eventually wears down the Carthaginians, and eventually Hannibal is defeated and they have to move back. But so the Fabian Society were committed to what we call a gradualist approach, like Fabius, that you don't have to have this one big leap to socialism. Socialism can be achieved gradually over a longer period of time. The Webbs are still fundamentalist socialists. They still broadly share the same aims as the original Marxists, but they differ on them in terms of revolution. You don't need a revolution. key things in the development of this was, one, the extension of the franchise, and that working class people were going to get the vote, and therefore if you formed socialist parties, working class people would vote for them, and then you could have socialist parties in Parliament. And then you could also have, parallel to this, political education. You convinced the key elites in society, the newspaper editors, university professors, etc., about the benefits of socialism. And this also meant that their view of the state changed as well. The state was no longer simply a bourgeois state. The state could be like a neutral arbiter, like the liberal conception of the state, which can be used to help the transition to socialism. So, according to the Webbs, socialism could be achieved gradually, and also the state shouldn't be overthrown. It can be expanded, with the state run by what they would call a technocratic elite, these expert bureaucrats, and they should be allowed to impregnate all the existing forces of society. And they could govern society rationally, and the Webbs again were fooled by Stalin because they looked to the Soviet Union and thought this was what it should be like. They thought the Soviet Union was characterized by the deliberate planning of all the nation's production, distribution and exchange, not for swelling profits of the few, but for the increasing consumption of the whole community. So again, a very common trait among UK and general socialists is kind of very planned economy, planned engineered society. Webbs disliked capitalism simply because they thought it was too volatile, it was too messy, and therefore this planned rational society where matters may be resolved by rational, educated and civic-minded officials, a bit like themselves really. And this kind of approach foreshadows some of the sort of paternalistic and patronising approach of many socialist intellectuals towards ordinary people. And there's a famous quote by the Labour and Douglas Jay after World War II, when Labour was in power, and he said, famously, the man from Whitehall knows best, that we can manage society for the benefit of everybody, and everybody's patted on the head and told accept what's happening. So Beatrice Webb, or the Webbs, just put Beatrice in, but Sidney had a good part as well, the husband. Links to the ends of socialism, human nature, we are naturally cooperative, but violent revolution will do more harm than good. Not only that, but you don't actually need it. Still in favour of common ownership, but a gradual abolition of private property and capitalism. Again, in favour of greater equality, but again, a gradual transition towards it. Key change was the state. The state had become a neutral state, which could be used to effect a gradual transition to socialism. And the state was expanded with the use of experts, providing a template and administering more socialist society. And this was, the epitome of evolutionary socialism, the phrase, the inevitability of gradualness, a gradual parliamentary constitutional strategy towards achieving socialism through evolutionary means. Still quite fundamentalist in terms of the ends, but just very different in terms of the means. So that leads us on to Beveridge and Keynes. Would be obviously horrified to be included here, but just as they played a key role in the development of modern liberalism, Keynesian ideas and Beveridge's report played a key role in what we call revisionist socialism post-World War II. And Beveridge's ideas and Keynes's ideas are adopted by parties of the left, socialist parties, what we call social democratic parties post-World War II. And they were in fact the dominant themes until the emergence of neo-revisionism in the 1990s. And it kind of echoes that famous put down of Disraeli, of Peel, and Peel reformed the Corn Laws. The socialist parties in effect pinched the liberals, modern liberals, clothes while they were bathing. So Beveridge and King's ideas play an important role in what's termed revisionist socialism, which really comes to the fore after World War II, although it was foreshadowed by Bernstein. And the key thinker most associated with revisionist socialism is Anthony Crosland. And with revisionist socialism, it keeps the gradualist parliamentary approach. So revolutionary socialism is practically gone now. All subsequent socialists are evolutionary. But not only that, but it changes what socialism is about. So socialism is no longer about individual shopping list of common ownership, class politics, etc., etc. Crossland in particular redefined socialism as the pursuit of social justice, which is a much more amorphous concept. It can mean anything to different people who talk about it. Social justice, broadly, a fairer society. And I suppose Crossland, again, like the Webb, is a fairly typical British socialist. Very middle class family. He goes to Highgate private school and then on to Oxford to do what else but PPE. He's a bit of what's called a champagne socialist. He likes the good life. But in 1951, Crossland argues, before he writes his most famous book, The Future of Socialism, that subsequent to the labour reforms, that Britain had ceased to be a capitalist country because of this establishment of the welfare state and the managed economy, that things had changed. And he also rejects Marx's kind of binary division of society into two classes. And he said society has become much more complex and different groups had emerged, these technocrats and a managerial class. And it was too simplistic to simply talk about two opposing classes. And then in his 1956 book, The Future of Socialism, Crossland argues that through the adoption of the modern liberal mechanism of Keynesian economics, capitalism shouldn't be abolished. It can be tamed or it can be humanized to provide more stability. And if you have a stable capitalist system, you will have regular tax receipts coming in, and therefore you can use these tax receipts to provide a constant expansion of public spending, which can be used to provide a constant expansion of state welfare, and this virtuous circle, a constant progress towards the ultimate socialist goal of a greater equality and greater social justice, which is his redefinition. So you can see how Crossland is in a way building on Bernstein's argument about capitalism cohabiting with a greater drive towards socialism. And again, within the welfare state, again, the modern liberal idea adopted by revisionist socialists, education would also play a key role in achieving greater equality. And again, this leads to the drive towards the introduction of comprehensive schools. And Crossland famously said he disliked grammar schools because he thought they were divisive. He said it's the last thing he ever does. He was going to abolish every fucking grammar school, quote unquote. Although I can't find anything about him abolishing private schools, and certainly not his alma mater, Highgate. Of course, there is an old joke about the difference between extremists and moderates in the Labour Party. The extremists want to abolish private schools straight away, whereas the moderates want to wait until their own children are finished first. So maybe I'm just getting cynical in my old age. But anyway, Crossland links to the aims of socialism. Common ownership, no longer needs to abolish private property or nationalise every corner shop, only the commanding heights of the economy. So equality, a move away from absolute to relative equality, and you can see that typified in the quote down here. I'm sure that a definite limit exists to the degree of equality which is desirable. We do not want complete equality of incomes, and sexual responsibility and exceptional talent require and deserve a differential reward. This idea of everybody needs an incentive, adopting a liberal approach. It's a bit more meritocratic, so it's not absolute equality but relative equality. Again, similar to the Webb's, the state can be used to affect this transition to a fairer society, not necessarily socialism, because socialism is redefined as social justice. And the economy, this mixed economy, rather than abolishing private property, and capitalism can be tamed or humanized to lead to constant expansion of public spending and expansion of welfare. And it's evolution, it's parliamentary. There's no talk of revolution at all. And so these revisionist ideas dominate parties of the left, Social Democratic Party, right up until the 70s, which we mentioned in liberalism, which sees the emergence of neoliberalism. And then after successive election defeats, we end up with another bout of revisionism and the development of neo-revisionism. And the key thinker associated with neo-revisionism is Anthony Giddens, or Baron Giddens, who was an academic at the LSE, and he's written across a range of disciplines, but he's most associated with the third way, or neo-revisionism. So we saw in the class notes on liberalism, particularly the triumph of the new right ideas, especially in economic ideas, forces parties of the left to reevaluate what their aims are, and leads to a bout of revisionism. just an interesting aside, when we do conservatism, conservatives are the parties always accused of being pragmatic and opportunistic and willing to change what they stand for just to stay in power. And of course, Labour has been just as, inverted commas, pragmatic and opportunistic as the Conservatives. They've changed far more, arguably, than the Conservatives from where they started. But they don't tend to get criticised for being pragmatic. Maybe it's because Labour's pragmatism might be seen as a more nobler end. But anyway, you get this new bout of neo-revisionism. And Giddens' argument was, instead of sort of raging against the free market, this new neoliberal economy, modern socialists should simply go with the flow. You should encourage further privatisation, further deregulation as a means of boosting economic growth. You embrace capitalism. None of this tinkering about regulating or taming or humanize. You let it go. This turbocharged capitalism, again echoing Croston's argument, provide more tax revenues in which the government can then use to enhance a fairer society. And I mean, to an extent, in the boom years of the 90s and the early noughties, till the crash in 2008, this is really what happened in the UK, where public spending rises significantly in education and health on the back of kind of the boom of the noughties. Then it all came crashing down. And also there's this broader kind of liberal view of expanding cultural and sexual equality and redistributing power, devolution, the Human Rights Act, etc. But under neo-revisionism, there's no talk of any form of common ownership or renationalising industries that have been privatised under the Conservative governments. Much more stronger preference for private property. Again, very cynical of the welfare system. Welfare had to be mended, not ended. And Giddens and other people at that time, and Social Democrats, were very critical of the welfare state and picked up on some of the neoconservative arguments about cultural dependency. And you needed to have active rather than passive welfare. Welfare was a hand up, not a handout, a very kind of modern liberal approach. And no, not even talk of relative equality. It's about equality of opportunity. There was a nice quote down there about, I've quoted a lot from Blair because some of the Giddens stuff isn't that quotable. But Blair, it's not a burning ambition for me to make sure that David Beckham earns less money. So long as he's paying his taxes, that's fine, and then we'll use the taxes for something else. So neo-revisionism links to the ends or aims of socialism. Common ownership gone. Equality is about equality of opportunity. The state has a role to play. All parties of the left have a kind of positive role of the state, but it's different with neo-revisionism. The state is more like a facilitator, allowing people who are excluded, or social inclusion became a big term, to help them take part in this new globalized dynamic economy, particularly through education. And Blair's famous, he said, his three priorities if he was elected would be education, education, education. In terms of the economy, dynamic market economy, which is a phrase from the new clause 4, and turbocharged capitalism will provide the financial underpinning of greater social justice. And New Labour in the UK and did Fresh Start, minimum wage, spending on education and NHS. So it worked for a while, and again, it's all parliamentary. There's no talk of revolutionary socialism at all. And again, some of the quotes I've included down there, some of Blair, class war is over, Mrs. Thatcher's enterprise was right. So in a way, you can argue that neo-revisionism is indistinguishable from modern liberalism. There's a few red tinges around the side about a fairer society, but you can understand why Blair would quite happily sit down and sup with Paddy Ashdown, who was leader of the Liberals at the time. So that was neo-revisionism, and then we had the crash, and then we moved on to Corbynism, if there is such a thing, which was a kind of throwback to more post-World War II social democracy. But obviously the society had moved so far to the right that it was seen as socialist or communist at the time. And now, just as I'm doing this, we have a new leader in Keir Starmer, a new leader of the Labour Party, and I think we'd actually see something called Starmerism. I don't know, it sounds like a medical condition. We'll just have to wait and see. But there's our key thinkers in socialism: Engels, Marx and Engels, Luxembourg, Webb, Croston, Giddens, Lenin. Certainly you could use the tensions within socialism, even the tensions within the revolutionary strand. Bernstein leading on to the development of revisionist socialism and also evolutionary socialism linked with Webb, how the two liberal politicians, struck thinkers, fed into social democracy. Revisionism, of course, them as well, and Giddens was a pretty bigger space where revisionism saw a huge shift, complete shift away from Marx and Engels' original